give a quick talk today about how we plan our garden for the year. And this is hopefully a lesson that can show you guys a way to plan your garden. It's very simple, and it's an easy place to kind of start if you're wanting to get started gardening or get back into it. It's an easy way for you to think through the garden plan for the year, what plants you need to buy, what seeds you might need to buy, and what you're going to plant in the garden where throughout the whole year. So come along and we'll learn a little bit today. So the first step to planning your garden for the year is to think about your space. I like to end the first step by having a finished map drawn of my garden, and this is just the outlines. So if you're growing in a few raised bed gardens, your map might look something like this. It's just a rough representation of the box gardens that you have, how many, which way they lay. One important thing to note is which direction is south for you. So this will matter, especially if you're trying to grow in the early spring or in the late fall. Another thing to note on your map is the square footage. So if you're going to be employing the square foot gardening method, it's good to know that, okay, my boxes are 8 feet by 3 feet or 4 feet by 2 feet. Making sure you put in things like your pathways, where your water source is. It might be good to indicate that on the map just so you know where your hose can come in from. So once I make a map, I keep that map from year to year and I just make copies of it, but the map kind of stays the same every year, and we just move around the crops, and you can rotate your crops, but that's kind of down the road, so I wouldn't worry too much about crop rotations. Roughly draw out, your box garden or whatever it is, and then we can decide how we want to break that down. If you're interested in the square foot gardening method, you can draw grid lines like I've done here on the bottom. I'm going to have 4 rows in my garden area, so I'll just number the rows and draw a small little line to represent, okay, these are different rows within this plot. So you can see those up here. Okay, step number 2 when you're planning your garden for the year is to think about, and this is separate from your map, think about the crops that you want to grow. Think deeply about what you or your family likes to eat on a regular basis throughout the spring, summer, and fall. Think what is expensive at the grocery store, like maybe onions or potatoes or something like that. Maybe it's not best to grow them in your home garden. Think about something that you really prefer to have fresh. So maybe herbs come to mind, or lettuce, fresh lettuce, or kale, because you just want to go and get fresh kale out of your garden. Once you've thought through those crops, the next column you'll want to fill out for each of those crops is, do you plant this crop by seed or do you transplant this crop? Well, a couple examples would be carrots. Almost always carrots are done by seed. A counter example would be tomatoes. Almost always tomatoes are grown when you put a transplant into the ground. And then next, you'll want to have a column that lists the days to maturity. So this is essentially from the time you've planted the crop, how long until that crop is ready to be harvested from. And this will be different for every crop. There's resources to help you find that information. So radishes, for example, can be ready in as little as 21 days or 30 days. Pumpkins, on the other hand, 110 days from seed until harvest. So it's good to know how long will this crop be in my garden. With transplants especially, you'll want to know, is that days to maturity the overall time, or is that the days to maturity from just transplanting to harvesting? So it's pretty easy to figure that out. Most of the time, if it's a seed, the information will be on the back of your seed packet. If it's a transplant, a lot of times in a seed catalog, it'll have the crop, say tomatoes. You can go to the tomato section and it'll say 68 days. Another thing to note is this crop done once that time limit is reached? Like a radish, you pull a radish out of the ground physically and it's out of there. Or is it like a tomato where you're harvesting continually off of the same plant? So 2 different things to note on your different crops that you prefer. Are they one and done, or are they continual harvest? And then the last thing I like to list on my crop list is a rough estimation of when to plant this crop. Well, it's good to know, can I plant this crop in the spring when I might still have cold days or cold nights? Will it be okay? Or should I kind of wait to plant this crop until after say this is only a summertime crop. The next step in the process is to go ahead and place your crops that you like and you want to grow onto the map of your garden. All the information you put on your plant list or your crop list will help you to fill in your map. If you got the crops that you like, can you fit them all in your garden? That's always the big question. Like how many actual plants of each crop will go into the garden? That's the next step. So this step is very simply just saying, I want carrots here, beets here. After those get taken out, I would like to replace it with some fall cabbage. And I can kind of show you visually how I like to do that now. When writing the crops onto the map, I like to think of the bed as a way to represent time. So at the leftmost side of the bed is spring, and then in the middle of the bed, time progresses. Okay, now it's a summer crop, and then at the end of the bed, all the way to the right side, that's what you're going to put in that bed in the fall. A mini timeline. Each bed has a story throughout the year, and so you can write down what you hope the story for that bed will be. Now, a couple more things to consider as you're placing your crops into the map. One would be shade. And so really tall crops can shade things out underneath them. And sometimes that's a good thing, and sometimes it's a bad thing. Corn can grow very tall, we know, and it could shade out, say, your pepper plants that were planted directly to the north of it. So typically our sun is in the southern sky, and if the shade cast on the northern side of your garden would be detrimental to that crop, you might want to think about putting your corn on the very northern side of your garden and letting the southern side of your garden be for shorter crops. One thing that you can also do is to share vertical supports or trellises between different crops. One thing that is fun to do is to plant snow peas or sugar snap peas early in the year, and then you could utilize that same trellis once those plants have finished for something like green beans or pole beans, or even you could plant a late crop of cucumbers or something like that and let them climb up that same trellis. Another thing you can think about, and is really popular in the gardening world, is companion planting. And that's a strategy where you will plant a crop that likes being next to another crop. They like to be next to each other for different reasons, and it's good to understand those reasons. For example, have marigold flowers near some of your vegetables, and those marigold flowers give off a smell that certain insects don't like, and so the insects won't then come and find your vegetable. Another one is kind of like I mentioned, the shading effect before. And then lastly, some crops share nutrition in the soil well together, and others compete against each other. For example, you had tomatoes right next to some beans, or maybe they get planted into a crop where beans were last year, into a bed where beans were last year. Some of that excess nitrogen that the bean family had put into the soil could be utilized the next year by the tomatoes. Native Americans found out and realized that corn or maize could be a trellis that green beans could grow up. And so they were symbiotically helping each other out. Likewise, the beans were fixating nitrogen into the soil and increasing the fertility of the soil, allowing the corn to grow taller and stronger. And then lastly, they would plant squash throughout the area. Squash kind of vines all over the place, and it effectively creates a living mulch, or like a weed barrier, because they have big leaves, they shade the sun, and so no small weeds can pop up in that area because the squash leaves are everywhere. So in that way, they were growing three crops symbiotically close together and became known as the Three Sisters. Cool bits of information and history that we still lean on today. The last step in planning your garden is to take a look at your finished map and take a look at that crop list that you've developed, and decide what resources you need for the year. Those main resources that I see as people needing are some sort of soil or compost or fertilizer to help them start in the year, to make sure their garden beds are really full of fertility and ready to grow. And then of course you'll need seeds and or transplants. So you can buy those seeds from a local garden store or hardware store, or you can go online and buy them. One thing I'll caution on transplants is that only put them out when the weather looks really good. If you can kind of gently ease your starts, your transplants into the new environment, they'll have a better success rate. So one technique you can do is called hardening off. And so that's where you'll take your transplants and you'll set them out in the sun and in the wind for a couple hours. And then you'll bring them back into your warm windowsill. And then the next day you'll do the same thing. And so over a course of a week, you're kind of exposing them to some of the elements, but bringing them inside so that they're warm. So it kind of prepares them for life outside in the garden. Another thing on transplants is that sometimes at nursery centers or hardware stores or anywhere really, they can be watered every day with a fertilizer solution. And so that's fine, but once you take them and put them into your garden, they're relying on and they're expecting that fertilizer solution every single day. And when they don't get it, they go into transplant shock. So it's okay, they'll probably recover, but that might happen if they're used to getting that fertilizer solution every single day and then they stop getting it. And then another resource that you're gonna need is some sort of mulch or weed fabric or weed suppression. It's kind of nice to, once you get your transplants in the ground or your seeds have popped up and they're really doing well, to add straw or to add leaves around the outside of your garden, and it prevents the weeds from growing up through there. Another resource you'll need to plan out is how are these crops going to get water, especially if you're trying to germinate seeds. They need to be moistened continually for the 4 days or 5 days or sometimes up to 10 days that it takes for them to germinate. Watering is a whole kind of other commitment and another task, but it's good to know that your garden at least has water nearby. It's kind of nice at this stage to kind of plan out your time. You know, gardens need a little bit of time throughout the year once they're planted to maintain them. It's a lot less time and less of a burden if you kind of schedule it. One last tip on placing your crops into your map. This is not set in stone. Be open to change, allow it to change. It's not gonna mess up your crop rotation or your big plans. You know, you're just trying to see something grow and watch it get bigger and hopefully eat it. So that's it. I hope you had fun learning a little bit. If you have questions about any of these planting techniques, you know, let me know. And likewise, if there's anything that had a question pop up for you, say, could we do a video on that? Could you teach us more about that? Please feel free to let us know. This was just meant to be a quick introduction on how we plan our gardens, how you could plan your garden at home. And so hopefully it was helpful. We've enjoyed talking to you, and have a great day.